All right, welcome back. Yesterday we talked about section one, which covered the events that led up to the French Revolution, up to the storming of the Bastille, July 14th, 1789. Today we're going to continue down that path and see what happens with the National Assembly as the French Revolution unfolds. Our objectives in this section will explain how the political crisis of that same year, 1789, leads to popular revolts. We'll look at, one could argue, the pretty aggressive changes and reforms that were brought about by that first National Assembly in that summer of 1789. We'll look at additional actions that the National Assembly takes as it moves forward toward its constitutional government. And then we'll pause for a moment and take a look at what the reaction is around the rest of Europe to these revolutionary events that are unfolding in France. As you can imagine, with the rest of Europe being ruled by monarchies, they might have a predictable reaction to the revolutionary fervor within France. Our focus question: what political and social reforms did the National Assembly institute in the first stage of the French Revolution? To their credit, the members of this first National Assembly did what they said they were going to do. So by and large, they voted to end their own privileges, including providing equal rights to all male citizens before the law, regardless of social status, the abolishment of their exclusion from taxes, so extending taxation to the first and the second estate. Overall, trying to make the system much more just, much more equitable for everyone involved. Now, when historians look back at the French Revolution, they divide it into four different phases. In this section, we're going to look primarily at this first phase, the National Assembly, 1789, again, beginning back with that tennis court oath, where France becomes a constitutional monarchy. The next phase is the crazy phase, the Reign of Terror, 1792 to 1794. A radical phase where we have increasing violence, increasing anarchy, actually, and we see quite literally the end of the monarchy. The third stage is a little reaction to the sort of overreach of the craziness of the Reign of Terror, the Directory, 1795 to 1799. Again, a reaction against the extremism that was prevalent in the Reign of Terror. And then the final stage, the Age of Napoleon, 1799 to 1815, where a lot of the changes that had happened during the Revolution are kind of come together. Certainly, it's happening within and beyond the borders of France, because we have France at war with basically the entirety of Europe. But we'll talk about Napoleon at some later stage. You can imagine in 1789, after the storming of the Bastille, the formation of the National Assembly, the nation was in political crisis and it was a crazy time. At the same time, 1789, there was a tremendous famine, which led to severe shortages. And in this time of, at least in today's viewpoint, less than stellar communications, rumors were by and large what people acted on. So in that summer of 1789, we have this period, middle of July to the beginning of August, known as the Great Fear. And the rumor circulating among the peasants was that government troops were going to come in and seize the crops, leaving the peasants with nothing left to feed themselves. Now, the peasants blamed the nobles, who they thought were trying to sort of solidify their position again, reinstitute some of the dues and services that they had been due under the feudal system. So the peasants took matters into their own hands, picked up any kind of weapons they could find, even if it was farm tools, certainly guns. They attacked manor houses, stole grain, and generally demonstrated the anger that the third estate, the majority of the third estate, the peasants, were feeling about this unjust system. But as we also saw in the video yesterday, not all of this was about these Enlightenment ideas. In this case, a lot of the frustration and the violence was the result of fear of hunger. So they were doing what they could to feed their families. Now, Paris, as it is for many things at this point, was the revolutionary center of the crisis. There were within the city several different factions or groups that were struggling with each other to gain control and to gain power. Two main groups that were struggling for power. The first, a more moderate group led by the General Marquis de Lafayette. Again, this is the same Lafayette that fought alongside George Washington in the American Revolution. He's described in the book as the hero of two worlds. And the National Guard, again, was primarily a middle-class militia, so they came from the bourgeoisie, and they were more moderate in their political beliefs. To the extreme, another group was called the Paris Commune, and they were one of many radical groups. There were certainly groups that were even more radical than the Paris Commune, but they had pretty tremendous power. They had taken over control of the city government, which had been run by the monarchy in Paris. They were able to mobilize reaction at a moment's notice, so able to get mobs of people wherever they needed to get. And these were the groups, the radicals, the commune and others that were spreading stories about the royal family, calling for an end to the monarchy, and other much more radical policies than the National Guard would have advocated. Here's Marquis de Lafayette and members of the Paris Commune. It might be hard to imagine that in that chaotic summer of 1789 that any kind of government work or legislation could happen, but it did. The National Assembly marched forward down the path that they stated they were going to march, in beginning with the Tennis Court Oath. We mentioned in the beginning with the Tennis Court Oath that initially the National Assembly was entirely made up of members of that third estate. Well, as the summer went on, more and more members of the first and second estates, the more moderate members, reform-minded members, trickled over and joined the National Assembly. So at some point during the summer, the National Assembly becomes much more representative of France as a whole, not just members of that third estate. As a National Assembly, they vote to give up any dues that might be due to the nobles. They end up any exclusive rights they might have to certain lands that would now be open to everyone. Nobles end their special legal status, and perhaps most importantly, they end any exemptions they have or that the First Estate has from paying taxes. Now, historians can argue that in giving up these rights, in giving up the special status and these exemptions, they really didn't vote to get rid of anything that they hadn't really lost already. It was very unlikely that they were going to go back to, in this chaos, the status quo as it was with an absolute ruler, Louis XVI. So arguably, they were doing what they recognized had already happened, but you do have to give them some credit for moving in that direction. One of the first things they do as well is enacting a statement that explains or stands for the equality of all male citizens under the law. So toward the end of the summer, August 1789, they release a document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Now that should ring a familiar bell, as it's modeled after the American Declaration of Independence. So just like our Declaration of Independence, it announces free and equal rights for all men, natural rights, so going back to John Locke and the idea of natural rights that emanate not from God, but are just intrinsic in human beings, equality before the law for all men, regardless of what social status you are, what economic status you are, freedom of religion for all citizens, and also taxes that are levied fairly across all social classes, not just those that had been in the Third Estate. As you can imagine, this Declaration of the Rights of Man was certainly supported by a lot of people, but there were specific groups that were not entirely supportive. One group, women, because the Declaration of the Rights of Man did not grant citizenship or equal status for women. One of the prominent people in opposition to that was a very outspoken Marie Olympe de Gouges. We'll talk a little bit more about her later. And as you can imagine, Louis XVI, although at some point he kind of tepidly supported the National Assembly, once they start enacting actual legislation, policies, and make these broad statements, he's a little concerned because it's going to eventually impact what he sees as his absolute power and control over France. I remember in 1789 we're having a tremendous famine, and remember how hunger is driving some of this revolution, some of this violence, not entirely this embracing of Enlightenment ideas. So in October of 1789, we have a march made up primarily of peasant women marching in the pouring rain from France, or from Paris to Versailles, screaming bread and demanding when they get to Versailles to see the king. One focus of their anger was the wife of Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette. Now, Marie Antoinette, again, the wife of Louis XVI, she wasn't born in France. She was born in Austria. She's the daughter of Maria Theresa and the brother of the current leader of Austria, Joseph II, who we talked about as one of those enlightened despots. Now, although Marie Antoinette had done some actions to help the poor, any good actions that she had done were overshadowed by the luxurious lifestyle that she led. She was opposed to any reforms coming out of the National Assembly. She was bored with things at the court, and oftentimes she would retreat to her own little chateau on the grounds of Versailles and sort of live her life very luxuriously. And that certainly at this point in time angered people. Now, these women who were marching out to Versailles in the pouring rain in October of 1789 had heard rumors that the Queen had large amounts of grain stored at Versailles, and they came out there demanding access to that, but more importantly, expressing their anger at the Queen and at the King. As you can imagine, this would be fairly intimidating, and somehow they were able to basically kidnap or at least force the King and Queen to march back, and they marched back at the front of this parade from Versailles to Paris and forced them to stay in the palace in Paris as virtual prisoners. The thought being that they can keep a much closer eye on the royalty if they're there close to the citizenry in Paris and not out retreating in the luxury of Versailles. Meanwhile, the National Assembly moves forward. In 1790, they place the Catholic Church under state control, so no longer under the control of Rome. They dissolve the convents and the monasteries, seize church land with the intention of using that land to satisfy some of its debt, ending papal control, so control of the Pope over the French Church. And interestingly, they make bishops and priests elected positions, so not appointed by the Pope, but elected salaried positions responding and responsible to the government. You can imagine the Pope in Rome didn't look upon this too kindly. The Pope condemned it, many bishops and priests condemned it, and interestingly, a large number of the peasants, and again, the Catholic Church, you got to remember, is very important, the Catholic faith, their salvation, is very important to the peasants. So they weren't entirely happy with this disruption, this change in how the church was going to operate. Remember the tennis court oath in 1789. Well, by the time we get to 1791, the National Assembly produces that constitution that they swore they would do. And basically, they set up a limited monarchy or a constitutional monarchy. Think of it in terms looking very similar to like we have in England. So we still have a king or a queen, but they're much more of a figurehead. They don't have a lot of real power, and certainly they don't get their power by the divine right of God. So under this new constitution in 1791, it is the Legislative Assembly. And you'll notice we have a new name here, not the National Assembly, but under that first constitution, it's the Legislative Assembly. So the Assembly has the right and the power to make laws, collect taxes, decide issues of war and peace, and it would be elected by members or citizens who pay taxes and are over the age of 25. Now, the moderates in France looked at this first constitution in 1791. They were pretty happy with it, and they kind of saw this as, well, this is good enough. We can live with the constitutional monarchy. We don't care if we have a king, so long as he doesn't have absolute power. And for them, this completes the French Revolution. So faced with the idea of continuing to be king under a constitutional monarchy, Louis XVI decided that wasn't something that he could live with. So he and his wife Marie Antoinette decided that they would make a run for it. Under the cover of night, they tried to escape Paris. He disguised as a servant, she as a governess, but unfortunately on their way out of town, they were stopped, and the king was recognized based upon his portrait on a coin. And they were again humiliatingly marched back to the royal palace in Paris. During the march back to Paris, as you can imagine, the crowds were extremely upset with the king, throwing insults at him. To many, they saw his attempt at an escape as a revelation that he's a traitor to the revolution, which certainly he probably was, because he wasn't supporting the actions of the Legislative Assembly. For nations outside of France, any support that they showed the king was interpreted as being against the revolutionary activity that was happening there. So you can imagine rulers around France, again, who were monarchies, kings or ruled by kings or queens, were really concerned about what was happening in France, the French Revolution. They were fearful that this virus of revolution would spread to their own borders as well. And these stories that were spread by people fleeing, mostly nobles from France, talking about how their property was seized, all these changes that were being made, the rioting of the peasants, fanned the flames of opposition to the revolution. In Austria and in Prussia, these two rulers got together and they signed what is known as the Declaration of Pillnitz. Again, interesting word to say, which showed support for the monarchy in France and threatened to intervene to protect the French monarchy. Revolutionaries took this action from the powers outside of France as an opportunity to be proactive, and they prepared for war. Now, we talked earlier about the Paris Commune, radicals who had control of the city government in Paris. Well, we've got two other groups that are both radical in nature in Paris. One are the sans-culottes, literally translated to those without breeches, breeches being those silk pants that were worn by the nobility. The sans-culottes basically wore pants or pantalons, as you can see here in the picture. Now, they were made up primarily of the urban worker, so they were very poor, they were very radical. The second group were the Jacobins. Now, the Jacobins came from the middle class, most of them lawyers, intellectuals. They were a revolutionary political club, but they were members of the government. So they were members of this legislative assembly. So we have two radical groups, one within the government that can actually impact some change, and one outside of the government, both radical. And going forward, they will work together. Now, both of these groups thought that the constitutional monarchy set up by the Constitution in 1791 was not enough. They demanded a republic in France. They didn't want a king at all. Not only that, they wanted to extend this revolution beyond the boundaries of France and end tyranny and monarchy in the other nations of Europe as well. So even though you can imagine that a country in this condition, economically very unstable, somehow proactively decides that they're not going to wait until they're attacked, but they're going to proactively declare war on basically the rest of Europe. So in the Legislative Assembly, driven by the Jacobins, with the support of the Sans-Culottes, the Legislative Assembly declares war on Austria, Prussia, Britain, and other European states. So the chaos begins. Our definitions: factions, dissenting groups of people, in this case, factions fighting for control of Paris. Remember the National Guard and the Paris Commune. Marquis de Lafayette, the hero of two worlds, leader of the moderate middle-class militia in Paris, fought alongside George Washington in the American Revolution as well. Olympe de Gouges, a journalist who liked the idea of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, but felt that it should extend to equal citizenship for women. Marie Antoinette, the wife of Louis XVI, Austrian-born queen, certainly not the favorite of the Paris citizenry. An émigré, a person who flees his or her country for political reasons. In this case, it's primarily the nobles fleeing France as their property was seized, as there was rioting and violence, and a move to eliminate the monarchy and other privileges enjoyed by the nobility. The sans-culottes, working class men and women, really the meat, the heart of the French Revolution, certainly pushed it to its more radical extremes. Those radicals wanted to establish a republic, a system of government where officials are chosen by the people. So again, this idea the power of a government comes from the ground up. There is no monarchy in a republic. The Jacobins, working with the sans-culottes, but the Jacobins were from the middle class. They actually had a position within the government as members of that National Assembly. And that's the end of section 2. In section 3, we'll move forward and we'll talk about the crazy time of the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror. Stay tuned.